Today, we're delving into one of psychology's most controversial phenomena, the Lucifer effect. This fascinating concept emerged from the infamous Stanford Prison Experiment, a psychological study that profoundly shaped our understanding of human behavior, influencing fields from psychology and sociology to criminal justice. The experiment was so impactful that it was later adapted into the 2012 film, The Experiment. But what exactly was this experiment trying to prove? At its core, the Stanford Prison Experiment sought to demonstrate a disturbing truth about human nature. When ordinary individuals are placed in extraordinary circumstances, granted special privileges, or assigned particular roles, they undergo psychological and behavioral transformations that align with their new environment or status, regardless of their inherent personality traits. In simpler terms, the experiment challenged the notion that our behavior stems from our character. Instead, it suggested something far more unsettling. Our environment largely dictates who we become. The mastermind behind this revolutionary experiment was Philip Zimbardo, now 91 years old but only 38 when he conducted the study in 1971 as a psychology professor at Stanford University. Zimbardo's hypothesis was bold and controversial. Human psychology and behavior are primarily determined by external factors rather than innate characteristics. To test this theory, Zimbardo created a simulated prison in Stanford University's basement laboratory, a setting that would become the stage for one of psychology's most shocking revelations about the human condition. The experiment would demonstrate how quickly ordinary people could transform when given power over others, and conversely, how rapidly individuals could surrender their autonomy when placed in positions of subordination. What makes this experiment particularly haunting is that it wasn't designed to observe individuals with predispositions toward cruelty or submission. Rather, it sought to reveal how environmental factors could transform even the most balanced personalities into something unrecognizable, even to themselves. The implications of Zimbardo's findings continue to reverberate through our understanding of human behavior, raising profound questions about free will, moral responsibility, and the nature of evil itself. Are we truly autonomous individuals guided by our moral compass, or are we simply products of our environment, susceptible to transformation based on the roles we're assigned? As we explore the details of this experiment and its aftermath, prepare to question your assumptions about human nature, and perhaps even your confidence in your own moral fortitude. For the most disturbing revelation of the Lucifer effect isn't just that power corrupts, it's that this corruption might lie dormant in each of us, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The Stanford Prison Experiment unfolded in 1971 within the underground laboratory of Stanford University, but its roots ran much deeper into the personal history of its creator, Philip Zimbardo. To understand the experiment fully, we must first understand the man behind it and the questions that drove him to such controversial research. Born into poverty, Zimbardo had witnessed firsthand how environment shapes destiny. Many of his childhood friends had later become criminals, despite showing no early predispositions toward antisocial behavior. This personal experience stood in stark contrast to the prevailing scientific wisdom of his time, which heavily favored genetic determinism, the belief that human character and behavior were primarily dictated by inherited traits rather than environmental factors. In the medical and sociological communities of the early 1970s, the concept of like father, like son, wasn't just a saying but a scientific paradigm. The children of exceptional individuals were expected to inherit excellence, while those born to criminals were viewed as genetically predisposed to criminality. This perspective troubled Zimbardo deeply, as it seemed to dismiss the possibility of social mobility and personal transformation. My friends weren't born criminals, Zimbardo would later reflect. They were good people trapped in desperate circumstances. This conviction fueled his determination to prove that environment, power dynamics, and assigned roles could dramatically alter human behavior, perhaps even more profoundly than genetic predisposition. At 38, now a respected professor at Stanford, Zimbardo designed his experiment to challenge these entrenched beliefs about human nature. He wanted to demonstrate that ordinary people could become monsters under certain conditions, and conversely, that those labeled as deviant might simply be products of their environment, rather than inherently flawed individuals. The experiment wasn't merely academic for Zimbardo, it was personal. Every time a former childhood friend was incarcerated, he saw not a criminal, but a victim of circumstance. His hypothesis directly challenged the fatalistic view that some people were simply born bad, suggesting instead that given the right conditions, anyone could descend into cruelty or rise to compassion. This context is crucial for understanding the experiment's design and Zimbardo's reluctance to terminate it even as conditions deteriorated. He wasn't just testing an abstract psychological theory. He was challenging a worldview that he believed condemned millions to predetermined fates based on their birth circumstances. Zimbardo's central question was revolutionary in its simplicity. What if the line between good and evil isn't drawn at birth, but is instead shaped by the situations we encounter and the roles we're assigned? What if the difference between a prison guard and a prisoner is not character but circumstance? These questions would soon be tested in ways that would shock the academic world and forever change our understanding of human behavior, power, and the fragility of moral identity when faced with the corrupting influence of authority. To test his revolutionary hypothesis, Zimbardo transformed Stanford University's basement laboratory into a remarkably authentic prison environment. Every detail was carefully considered to create an immersive experience that would blur the line between simulation and reality. This wasn't merely an academic exercise, it was an elaborate psychological stage designed to reveal the raw power of situational forces. The recruitment process began with a simple newspaper advertisement: male volunteers needed for a psychological study of prison life, $15 per day for 2 weeks. In today's currency, this would be approximately 100 daily, enough to attract nearly 100 applicants. From this pool, Zimbardo's team selected 21 participants who exhibited no psychological abnormalities, no history of violence, and no criminal background. These were, by all measurable standards, exceptionally normal young men. What happened next was crucial to the experiment's psychological impact. The roles of prisoner and guard were assigned completely at random. The flip of a coin determined who would wield power and who would surrender it. This randomization was vital to Zimbardo's hypothesis. If behavior was determined by personality rather than situation, the random assignment should produce no consistent behavioral patterns between groups. To create authentic psychological conditions, those assigned as prisoners experienced a genuine arrest procedure. Real police officers arrived at their homes, handcuffed them in front of neighbors, conducted thorough searches, and took them to actual police stations for booking. This wasn't play acting. The confusion, humiliation, and disorientation were genuine psychological experiences. Upon arrival at the Stanford County Prison, the dehumanization process continued. Prisoners were stripped, searched, deloused, and given uniform smocks with identification numbers. Throughout the experiment, they would be addressed only by these numbers, never by name, a deliberate strategy to strip away individual identity. Meanwhile, those randomly assigned as guards received uniforms, batons, and perhaps most significantly, mirrored sunglasses that prevented eye contact. This seemingly minor detail would prove psychologically crucial, as the inability to make eye contact reduced empathy and facilitated dehumanization. The rules established clear power dynamics. Prisoners must address guards as Mr. Correctional Officer, must obey all commands, and would have only 30 minutes of free time daily. Guards were instructed to maintain order, but were given considerable discretion in how to achieve this, with the critical limitation that no physical violence was permitted. The entire experiment would be filmed through hidden cameras, running 24 hours a day for the planned 2-week duration. One final, critical detail: participants were told that if anyone quit before the experiment concluded, or if rules were broken, no one would receive payment. This created a powerful group pressure to conform and continue, regardless of discomfort or ethical concerns. With these conditions established, Zimbardo had created not just a simulated prison, but a psychological crucible designed to test the limits of human adaptability and the power of situational forces to override individual personality traits. The stage was set for what would become one of psychology's most revealing and disturbing experiments. The Stanford Prison Experiment unfolded in 1971 within the underground laboratory of Stanford University, but its roots ran much deeper into the personal history of its creator, Philip Zimbardo. To understand the experiment fully, we must first understand the man behind it and the questions that drove him to such controversial research. Born into poverty, Zimbardo had witnessed firsthand how environment shapes destiny. Many of his childhood friends had later become criminals, despite showing no early predispositions toward antisocial behavior. This personal experience stood in stark contrast to the prevailing scientific wisdom of his time, which heavily favored genetic determinism, the belief that human character and behavior were primarily dictated by inherited traits rather than environmental factors. In the medical and sociological communities of the early 1970s, the concept of like father, like son wasn't just a saying but a scientific paradigm. The children of exceptional individuals were expected to inherit excellence, while those born to criminals were viewed as genetically predisposed to criminality. This perspective troubled Zimbardo deeply, as it seemed to dismiss the possibility of social mobility and personal transformation. "My friends weren't born criminals," Zimbardo would later reflect. "They were good people trapped in desperate circumstances." This conviction fueled his determination to prove that environment, power dynamics, and assigned roles could dramatically alter human behavior, perhaps even more profoundly than genetic predisposition. At 38, now a respected professor at Stanford, Zimbardo designed his experiment to challenge these entrenched beliefs about human nature. He wanted to demonstrate that ordinary people could become monsters under certain conditions, and conversely, that those labeled as deviant might simply be products of their environment, rather than inherently flawed individuals. The experiment wasn't merely academic for Zimbardo, it was personal. Every time a former childhood friend was incarcerated, he saw not a criminal but a victim of circumstance. His hypothesis directly challenged the fatalistic view that some people were simply born bad, suggesting instead that given the right conditions, anyone could descend into cruelty or rise to compassion. This context is crucial for understanding the experiment's design and Zimbardo's reluctance to terminate it, even as conditions deteriorated. He wasn't just testing an abstract psychological theory. He was challenging a worldview that he believed condemned millions to predetermined fates based on their birth circumstances. Zimbardo's central question was revolutionary in its simplicity. What if the line between good and evil isn't drawn at birth, but is instead shaped by the situations we encounter and the roles we're assigned? What if the difference between a prison guard and a prisoner is not character but circumstance? These questions would soon be tested in ways that would shock the academic world and forever change our understanding of human behavior, power, and the fragility of moral identity when faced with the corrupting influence of authority. Though terminated after just 6 days, the Stanford prison experiment yielded conclusions that would reverberate through psychology for decades. Zimbardo believed he had found the answer to his fundamental question: human character is remarkably malleable, shaped more by circumstance than inherent personality traits. What we witnessed, Zimbardo later wrote, was the power of situations to triumph over individual dispositions. The guards' transformation was particularly telling. Within mere hours, their initial hesitation gave way to authoritarian behavior, and within days, many embraced cruelty they would have previously considered unthinkable. This metamorphosis occurred not because these individuals harbored latent sadistic tendencies, but because their role authorized and even encouraged such behavior. Zimbardo coined the term Lucifer effect to describe this phenomenon, the process by which ordinary people, under the right conditions, can transform into perpetrators of evil. The name references Lucifer's fall from grace, symbolizing how good people can descend into darkness when corrupted by power. This concept would later be applied to explain historical atrocities, including the Nazi regime's systematic cruelty, where seemingly ordinary citizens became complicit in unspeakable acts. The experiment's findings challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature. Zimbardo argued that the traditional dichotomy between good and bad people was largely illusory. There is no inherent divide between saints and sinners, he concluded. The line between good and evil runs through each of us, shifting with circumstances, roles, and permissions. This perspective suggested something revolutionary. A criminal placed in a position of authority might perform admirably, while a respected leader in desperate circumstances might resort to theft. The implications were profound. Human behavior appeared to be less a product of individual character than a response to environmental cues, power dynamics, and role expectations. Among the three factors Zimbardo identified, environment, power, and role, he considered power the most influential. Power has an almost magical ability to transform perception, he noted. It alters not just how others see you, but how you see yourself and those over whom you have authority. The guards' mirrored sunglasses symbolized this transformation, creating both literal and metaphorical barriers to empathy. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that the corrupting influence of power affected not only the guards but Zimbardo himself. As the experiment's architect, he had unconsciously slipped into the role of prison superintendent, becoming so invested in the experiment's continuation that he overlooked clear ethical concerns. It took his wife's intervention, "You've become a prison superintendent, not a researcher," to break the spell. This self-transformation revealed something crucial. No one, not even those studying the phenomenon, was immune to the Lucifer effect. The experiment suggested that situational forces could override not just personality, but professional ethics and moral principles. Zimbardo had designed the experiment to prove environment trumps character, only to become unwitting evidence of his own hypothesis. The Stanford prison experiment thus offered a disturbing mirror to society, suggesting that institutional evil persists not because of bad apples, but because of bad barrels that corrupt whoever is placed within them. This systemic view of evil challenged traditional notions of individual responsibility and raised uncomfortable questions about human autonomy in the face of powerful situational forces. Despite its profound influence on psychology, the Stanford prison experiment has faced mounting criticism that challenges both its methodology and conclusions. These critiques have transformed our understanding of this landmark study, revealing layers of complexity that Zimbardo's initial interpretations may have overlooked. Years after the experiment, researchers contacted several participants to gather retrospective insights. Their testimonies cast doubt on the experiment's fundamental premise. One guard, Dave, revealed a crucial detail. "Zimbardo never explicitly told us to be harsh, but he did say to make it as realistic as possible, and that the more realistic, the better." This instruction created an implicit expectation that guards should behave severely to fulfill the experiment's goals. Dave further disclosed that he could sometimes hear Zimbardo and other researchers discussing the experiment from behind a partition. "Once I heard Zimbardo say, 'Turn the camera toward that guard,' and I realized they were filming me. I thought I should give them something worth recording." This revelation suggests some participants may have been performing rather than naturally responding to their roles, a fundamental challenge to the experiment's validity. If participants were consciously acting rather than genuinely transforming, the experiment's conclusions about human nature would be significantly undermined. As one critic noted, "A performance tells us nothing about natural behavior. It only reveals what people think is expected of them." The experiment's credibility faced another serious challenge in 2006 through an unexpected real-world application. 4 elite soldiers from the U.S. Army Rangers executed a meticulously planned bank robbery in Tacoma, Washington. The precision operation, completed in just 2 minutes and 21 seconds, displayed military-grade coordination. Police initially had no leads until a witness recalled the getaway vehicle's license plate. 3 days later, authorities arrested the getaway driver, 19-year-old Alex Bloom, a member of the Army Rangers. Bloom identified his 3 accomplices, all fellow Rangers, including the 20-year-old mastermind, Sergeant Summer. After 2 years of legal proceedings, Summer received a 24-year sentence for planning and executing an armed bank robbery and illegal weapons possession. The other 2 participants received 11 and 12-year sentences. Surprisingly, Bloom received only 16 months, a dramatically reduced sentence. The key factor in this leniency was the presence of Philip Zimbardo on Bloom's defense team. Zimbardo argued that Bloom's actions resulted from situational pressures rather than criminal intent. Summer was Bloom's superior officer. The military environment conditions soldiers to obey without question. After prolonged exposure to such rigid hierarchies, individuals lose their capacity for independent judgment. Using the Stanford prison experiment as evidence, Zimbardo convinced the court that Bloom's actions stemmed from environmental conditioning rather than personal choice. The court accepted this argument, resulting in the minimal sentence. However, after his release, Bloom made a shocking public admission. "I knew it was robbery, and I knew it was illegal, but I chose to do it anyway. This confession suggested Bloom had maintained his moral awareness and decision-making capacity throughout, directly contradicting Zimbardo's argument that environment had overwhelmed his judgment. This revelation triggered widespread concern that the Stanford Prison Experiment's conclusions could be misused to absolve criminals of personal responsibility. If Zimbardo's theory were taken to its logical extreme, nearly all criminal behavior could be attributed to environmental factors, potentially undermining the entire concept of legal culpability. As one legal scholar observed, if no one is responsible for their actions because environment dictates behavior, then our entire justice system becomes meaningless. This controversy highlights the profound ethical implications of Zimbardo's work and the dangers of over-applying psychological theories to complex moral and legal questions. The most unsettling aspect of Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment isn't simply that power corrupts, but rather the universality of this vulnerability. The experiment suggests that the capacity for cruelty lurks within each of us, awaiting only the right circumstances to emerge. This is perhaps why the study continues to disturb us decades later. It holds up a mirror to human nature that many find difficult to confront. When we observe the experiment from a distance, it's easy to think, "I would never behave that way." We comfort ourselves with the belief that we would resist, maintain our moral compass, and stand against cruelty, even when authorized to inflict it. Yet the experiment's most profound lesson challenges this comforting assumption. The participants weren't sadists or psychopaths. They were ordinary young men who scored within normal ranges on all psychological assessments. Their transformation wasn't the exception. It appears to be the rule. This realization forces us to consider a troubling question. Is the line between civilization and barbarism thinner than we imagine? The experiment suggests that the guardrails keeping society humane aren't primarily internal moral constraints, but external structures that either permit or prohibit certain behaviors. When those structures change, behavior follows with alarming rapidity. The Stanford Prison Experiment exists in a curious intellectual limbo, neither completely validated nor entirely debunked. Its methodology has been criticized, its ethics questioned, and its conclusions challenged. Yet few dispute the core observation that situational forces profoundly influence human behavior, often more powerfully than we recognize or wish to admit. Perhaps the most balanced perspective acknowledges both environmental influence and personal responsibility. While circumstances shape our choices, they rarely eliminate choice entirely. Most situations, even highly coercive ones, contain moments where alternative paths remain possible. The guards could have chosen kindness over cruelty. The prisoners could have maintained solidarity, rather than turning against each other. The experiment's legacy extends beyond academic psychology, offering insights into phenomena ranging from military abuses to corporate corruption. Whenever power concentrates without accountability, the conditions for the Lucifer effect emerge. This understanding has informed institutional reforms in prisons, schools, corporations, and military organizations, creating systems of checks and balances that acknowledge human vulnerability to situational forces. For individuals, the experiment offers both a warning and an invitation to greater self-awareness. Recognizing our susceptibility to role conformity is the first step toward resistance. By understanding how easily we can be manipulated by authority, uniforms, titles, and group pressure, we develop the vigilance necessary to maintain our moral agency even in challenging circumstances. The Stanford Prison Experiment ultimately tells us something profound about human nature. Not that we are inherently good or evil, but that we are remarkably adaptable, capable of both extraordinary compassion and shocking cruelty depending on the social context we inhabit. This adaptability is both our greatest strength and our most dangerous vulnerability. As we navigate a world filled with systems that shape our behavior in ways both subtle and overt, the experiment's lessons remain vital. By understanding the power of situations, we can design environments that bring out our best qualities rather than our worst impulses. And by recognizing our own susceptibility to corruption, we can remain vigilant against the darkness that, under the right conditions, can emerge from even the most ordinary human heart.